I feel like Alec Baldwin is going to the pokey, ladies and gentlemen. I hear a lot of people saying they think that the jello-haired part-time internet model who was running the gun safety operation, such as it was, is going to be the one who gets in the most trouble. But I think those people are allowing their focus to drift away from the most basic, most pertinent facts of the case. And since you don't come to this program to hear the regurgitation of other people's analyses, first, let's get this thing back down to brass tacks, and then I want to talk briefly about a couple of things that are fairly important in my view, but which I haven't heard anyone else mention. So, here's the brass tacks. Alec Baldwin shot a bitch. Alec Baldwin took a loaded firearm in his hand, pointed it at another person, and then pulled the trigger. 2 people got hit, one of them died. Now, if basic morality had the weight of law, it would be easy to say, but it was the jello-haired part-time internet model who screwed most of the pooches, so she's the one most at fault, so she should get the most punishment. But the thing is, basic morality and common sense don't have the weight of law. If it did, fathers would have the legal right to pummel the living shit out of guys who rape their daughters. But since we're not barbarians, even though we sometimes would like to be, even though sometimes barbarity is a good and proper and noble and virtuous undertaking, civilized people organize their societies around the rule of law. And the rule of law says that Hannah Gutierrez Reed, the jello-haired part-time internet model, who looks like she's gonna make some young man or lady very happy one day, did not kill anybody. Because I'm pretty sure there's no provision in New Mexico's murder statute that says, well, if you were the second to last person to handle the gun and you were supposed to make sure there weren't any live rounds in there and you forgot because you were off somewhere taking goddamn cat face selfies or whatever it is you youngsters do, then you're totally as culpable for the killing as the guy who pointed a loaded firearm at another person and pulled the trigger. And speaking of that, let's talk about what we know and what we don't know. We know this is a Western picture they were making, and the weapons were period appropriate to the early 1880s, so obviously we're talking about a revolver here. We know the camera wasn't rolling when the killing took place. They were in the process of blocking the scene, rehearsing the performances, and the scene required Baldwin's character to cross-draw, which I think means he's reaching across his body to unholster the weapon from the opposite hip, which means it would have to be in the holster backward, but whatever, and then aim it in the direction of the camera. So here's my first question that I haven't heard anybody ask. Irrespective of how it happened that 3 consecutive handlers failed to check the gun for live rounds, why were you rehearsing the scene with the hammer cocked? Because it can't be an accidental trigger pull unless the hammer is already backed. And why are you rehearsing a scene with your goddamn finger on the trigger? We keep hearing from the Free Alec Baldwin crowd, a group whose numbers seem to be rapidly dwindling, by the way, that this had to be someone else's fault. Because Alec Baldwin has been handling firearms his whole career. He has had all the best training, except, whoopsie! I guess all that fancy training didn't include things like, don't take somebody else's word for it when they hand you a gun and tell you it's unloaded, or don't block your cross-draw scene with the hammer cocked and your goddamn finger on the trigger. What else do we know? We know this was Hannah Gutierrez Reed's second picture as a movie armorer. We know she was so bad on her first picture that she freaked the fuck out of Nicolas Cage and people threatened to walk off the film if she wasn't let go. We know she was writing social media posts, presumably when she needed a break from buying lime green hair color and making creepy catface videos, in which she openly said she was not qualified for the job and should not have taken it. Furthermore, we know the firearms on the set were being stored in a non-standard manner on a cart outside the building, apparently, due to a need to comply with COVID restrictions. So here's a hypothetical question. What do you suppose it would look like if an unfortunate confluence of draconian, idiotic public health regulations and woke, diverse, inclusive, affirmative action hiring guidelines came together one day and conspired to turn a living person into a dead one? Mightn't it look a lot like this? There is no universe in which Hannah Gutierrez Reed should be working as a movie armorer. God, I hate that word. Armorer. I sound like Joe Biden when I try to say it. But anyway. By the first half of her conveniently hyphenated surname, I can deduce that she is probably half Latina, and she clearly is a woman, and from the looks of her, I don't have much trouble imagining a world in which she digs other chicks. And the Motion Picture Academy, they have those new woke bullshit rules. We talked about it when they first came out. God, it was like reading through the U.S. tax code, but basically your movie has to be woke as fuck or you ain't getting no Oscar. So you have to have a certain amount of diversity in front of the camera and a certain amount of diversity on the production crew. And could it be that Ms. Gutierrez Reed was simply hired because she ticks 2 and possibly 3 boxes on the woke Oscar checklist? And the fact that she was terrible at the job and potentially could get someone killed just had to be overlooked? Could it be that Alec Baldwin, as the lead producer on the picture, was the one who personally made the call to hire her? Oh, Alec, you're going to have so much to think about. In the best case scenario, your career is over, you avoid prison, and you spend the rest of your life selling off your possessions to pay off wrongful death judgments. In the best case scenario, you're going to get all that, plus a prison sentence in New Mexico. Because that's the other part lots of people are overlooking. The ones who keep saying, oh, nothing's going to happen to him. He's a Hollywood big shot. Now, first of all, if he was really still a Hollywood big shot, would he be shooting a self-financed $6 million indie western picture in New Mexico? Second of all, I think New Mexico has an acute shortage of judges and prosecutors who are sympathetic to the Hollywood liberal elite. But it's just a hunch. Hit the music, Jim Eagle. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where if you point a loaded sword at someone, you better be ready to run them through with it. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And we haven't talked yet about this whole Dave Chappelle brouhaha business. This thing that somehow has been a bigger news story than our botched withdrawal from Afghanistan and the thousands of U.S. citizens who remain trapped behind enemy lines. So let's do that, because it's becoming a bit of an important thing, this Chappelle business, if you ask me. Now first, I think this story offers a great object lesson in just how dishonest and corrupt the mainstream leftist news media are, even just in their news copy when they're supposed to be relating the most basic facts of the story. But there they are, casually referring to Chappelle telling jokes that offended the transgender community, or worse yet, transphobic remarks made during his recent Netflix comedy special. It is so dripping with overt bias. It's almost as bad as when they write about January 6th insurrectionists, as though it's just taken for granted as a matter of fact that Chewbacca Man and his barbarian hordes were trying to overturn the Constitution by farting on Nancy Pelosi's desk or something. But here's the thing with Chappelle. It's not a joke that the wokesters are complaining about. And there sure as shit was no transphobic remark. What did Chappelle say that created such a firestorm of controversy that it's been the biggest thing in the news for going on 3 weeks now? There was no joke. All he said was that it's impossible for a person to enter the world except through the legs of a human female, which is just a simple statement of biological fact, unless, of course, you were a C-section or a test tube baby. And somehow we got a transphobia scandal out of a comedian pointing out the true and unarguable fact that in order to make the journey from non-existence to life, you have to traverse the reproductive tract of a woman. The official response from the transgender community, and actually I need to stop here and complain a bit, because am I the only one who's so incredibly sick and tired of every group on the woke intersectional victimhood pyramid being referred to as its own community? The BIPOC community, the LGBTQEIEIO community, communities of color. It all just sounds so segregationist. Is it just me? Like our overlords imagine that we really exist as a bunch of separate and distinct communities that interact with each other as little as possible? Because if you live in the actual real world, as you and I both do, you live in a tolerant, pluralistic society where people of all demographics and all backgrounds live and work together all day, every day, and they mostly get along just fine. You want to talk about divisive rhetoric? That community talk is just about as divisive as it gets. It is vile and offensive and morally repugnant. All decent people should reject it out of hand. People who traffic in such language should be shunned from polite society. Now, where was I before that digression? So the response of the transgender community to Chappelle, well, let's call things what they are. Dave Chappelle is the last great comedian on planet Earth. When he comes out with a new special on Netflix, millions and millions of people are going to watch it because he's one of the few people who can still command an audience from the left and the right, because people know he goes after everyone equally and they respect him for it because that is what comedians are supposed to do. But he has already been marked for destruction and cancellation by the Twitter rage mob and the radical transgender crowd because they feel like he has said too many jokes that hurt their little feelings. They feel like he hasn't been sufficiently worshipful of the intersectional victim group that happens to sit at the apex of the woke intersectional victimhood pyramid right now, since around 5 minutes ago, which is the transgenders. Sorry, the transsexual community. You know, because in my town, all the transsexuals live on a certain street, and all the black folks live on a certain street, and all the Latinkses live on a certain street. The gay people don't get to have their own street anymore because they lost their slot in the victimhood pyramid to the transgenders, which, hey, sorry, these things happen. Now, when Bruce Jenner with tits is on your side, the sky is the limit in terms of your political power. So when this latest Chappelle special came out on Netflix, if he said one little thing about the transgenders, even obliquely, not even in the context of a joke that was at anyone's expense, but just a simple affirmation of the biological fact that a baby can't enter the world except through the body of a woman, it was a fait accompli that they would come after him and try to utterly wreck his life and career. So now the radical transgender crowd has attached itself like a barnacle to the hull of the USS Chappelle because, hey, this guy is really popular and he's already on our shit list, so let's see if we can't completely destroy his life and get some free pub in the process. For tolerance and inclusion, baby. But I think this stuff all makes more sense if we recognize what the real target is, because there's one common thread that runs through all of these radical leftist campaigns of cancellation and personal destruction. And the only high-profile commentator who's spoken out about it at any length is Jason Whitlock, who up until recently was a liberal Democrat sports columnist for the Kansas City Star, but now he's a regular guest on Tucker Carlson's show, and the radical leftists, of course, right on cue, are accusing him of being a white supremacist, but you've heard that story before. But Jason Whitlock is the one guy who has drilled down to the actual nub of what this is all about. It is an attack on manhood. It's not an attack on race or ethnicity or economic status or political ideology. Those are just the convenient framing devices. The actual target is any man who stands up like a man and says, no, I will not bend the knee to your crazy woke worldview. I will not pretend to believe things I know are not true. I will not censor my own speech because someone might get offended by what I say. I will not pretend things are healthy and normative that I believe are non-healthy and non-normative. So Jason Whitlock, of course, was voted right off of Woke Island for having committed 3 distinct crimes. 1, being a Christian. 2, loving his country. 3, believing in the value of manhood. None of that stuff is allowed anymore if you want to keep your Democrat voter registration card. You can't be a Democrat in the 3rd decade of the 21st century unless you believe firmly in the dastardly moral turpitude of the American Republic. You worship no God but the government, and you think all expressions of masculinity are toxic and ought to be disencouraged. Discouraged, as the case may be. So the Supreme Tribal Council of the American Transgender Nation, or whoever they are, told Dave Chappelle that he needed to come meet with them for a good old Chinese communist-style struggle session where he could prostrate himself on the floor and beg forgiveness for his many crimes, while the transgenders all whipped him with rods of bamboo and decried his many acts of counter-revolutionary activity. The whole point of the exercise is one of emasculation, to take the man's manhood away from him. Like when the BLM rioters made Eric Garcetti kneel in the middle of the street and recite the official white guy blood guilt oath. It wasn't about saying the words. It was about turning the man into a bitch, which Eric Garcetti was more than happy to do, but Dave Chappelle is not, which he made pretty abundantly clear in the response he gave during his stand-up set the night before last. "You will not summon me," he said. Which means he is onto their game, just like Jason Whitlock is. He knows the entire point is to make a man publicly emasculate himself. "If you want to have a conversation with me, it will be at a time and place of my choosing," he said, which is exactly right. The transgenders seem to have it in their heads that they are some sort of royal court. They can summon their subjects to an audience just by giving the word. Not offending the transgenders is supposed to be the focal point of every American's daily life. Which brings us to another thing the transgender and pro-transgender crowds have been saying a lot. In fact, it seems to be their number one justification for the effort to ruin Dave Chappelle's life for his crime of asserting the existence and the importance of the human vagina. They say that comedians shouldn't be allowed to make fun of transgenders because, as they put it, that is something called punching down. In other words, the transgenders are such a horribly marginalized community, so weak, so powerless, that a big, rich, famous comedian like Dave Chappelle shouldn't be allowed to mock them, or even to suggest that men can't become women simply by declaring it to be so. But pardon me? Are you fucking serious? Transgenders are a marginalized community? Like, how exactly? Has any smaller subgroup of the population ever enjoyed more outsized political power than transgenders do right now in the year 2021? I like to think of myself as a fairly accomplished amateur historian, but I will be damned if I can think of any precedent for this. The only tiny population subgroup that wields more political power than the transgenders is multi-billionaires, like the big tech oligarchs, guys like that. Transgenders in the United States of America in the 21st century, just about the least politically oppressed group of people that ever existed. In the current administration, it's a neck-and-neck race between the transgenders and the illegal aliens for who the most favored, most privileged group actually is. A group of people thinks it has the right to summon a comedian for a scolding session because he made one remark that caused them to be mildly offended, and they are the ones who are oppressed and marginalized? Someone will have to educate me on how that whole dynamic works. But I'm sure I'll have ample time to find out and think about it after they chuck my ass in the prison camp. But here's the bottom line. I refuse to live in a world, and I think Dave Chappelle would sign this memo too, where I am expected to preemptively censor my own speech according to whom it might offend. That is not a world in which any sane person should want to live. Free speech is the best and greatest and most crucially important of all the human rights. And a human right is one that exists simply because you exist. The most important animating principle of the American Revolution was the idea that there are certain unalienable rights that cannot be granted or taken away by any king or any government, but which each person enjoys by default, which are germane to the condition of having passed through the legs of a woman and thus become a living human being. The first among these is freedom of speech. It is the one upon which all the rest are predicated. With no free speech, there is no freedom of religion. There is no need to protect against unwarranted searches and seizures, and so on. And no son of a bitch possesses the power or the right to declare, I limit your right of free speech on the grounds that my precious, delicate little feelings might get hurt. Look, if you want to be a man who wears a dress in public, I will lay down my life in defense of your right to be a man who wears a dress in public. But that is where tolerance ends. And that is where my moral obligation ends. You cannot demand of me that I pretend to think your behavior is healthy and normative, because I do not think that. I think your behavior is most decidedly non-healthy and non-normative. Frankly, I think transgenderism is a rather monstrous manifestation of malignant narcissism, of self-importance run amok, of a morally rotten culture in which everything is negotiable. But here's a pro tip. If your life is so empty and void of meaning that you think putting your genitals through a blender is going to bring you happiness, it probably won't. If you want happiness, the most direct route is probably going to be learning to be comfortable living in your own skin rather than trading it in for a new skin. And what's more, I can't imagine ever wanting to live in a world where I can't be made fun of. Laughing at oneself is possibly the healthiest and most edifying of all possible pursuits. If you're incapable of laughing at your own expense, you're living a decidedly joyless life, and that's too bad. But you don't have any right to impose your own joylessness on the rest of us. So thank you for watching. Have a pleasant tomorrow. I will see you Friday. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.